had shifted from, for example, supporting al-Fatah and the PLO to supporting Islamic Jihad and Hamas. He openly proclaimed his support for their suicide bombing campaign. His agents were found to be involved with a number of extremist Muslim forces all the way over to the Philippines. And of course, the man who mixed the explosives for the first World Trade Center attack in the 90s, Mr. Yassin, was an Iraqi and was taken back into Iraq when he was on the lam from New York on bail. There was every ground to treat Saddam without the presumption of innocence, but it's not, of course, true that he was responsible for September 11th.
Well, I mean, what it seemed from a distance anyway was that whatever the good reasons for removing Saddam Hussein, and they were considerable, that the kind of emotional energy for it was generated by September 11 and the quite understandable desire of the Americans to strike out. And in striking out at Iraq, they perhaps used up some energy that would have been better spent striking out at Afghanistan. That seems to be the kind of...
I think that's a perfectly good point, but you have to remember that the United Nations had exhausted the number of resolutions it could pass condemning Iraq under several other headings. Invasion and occupation of the country, territory of neighboring states, violations of the Genocide Convention, attempting to exterminate the Kurdish minority in Iraq, fooling around certainly with weapons of mass destruction, in violation at any rate of all the resolutions on it. We don't know exactly to what extent, but refusing to come into compliance, which, given the record of theft of and use of these weapons, gave rise to the worst suspicions, and giving aid and comfort to a large number of terrorist organizations, secular and theocratic. So really, remember that when Bush asked for the first resolution, the entire membership of the Security Council voted 15-0, including Syria. Yes, Iraq can't go on being this much of an outlaw state. It's already a rogue state, and it's becoming a failed one.
Look, it is
terrible. We have a terrible Iraq in our future. In other words, whether we intervene or not. That's the only thing I'd like to, since we can't do this whole argument in this time, if I could leave your listeners with that thought, a terrible, maimed, traumatized, imploding Iraq that had also was ruining its society and its economy by the sanctions it brought upon itself, or its regime had brought upon the country, was in our future no matter what.
How's it been? Can I ask you a personal question in amongst all these intellectual questions? What's it been like for you personally? You must have had your whole friendship group turn against you at this point when you took this stance.
Well, boo-hoo.
Not your whole, but a big proportion of them.
Boo-hoo for me, and everyone, please bring out their biggest hanky and play their largest violin if that was true. And it was a risk I feel, compared to other risks other people have had to run. I mean, my Iraqi and Kurdish friends, who, by the way, were of the left, still are, were facing far worse under the conditions of fascism and war they were living under. But no, in fact, a lot of my dear friends at least took the view that it was a good thing that Saddam Hussein had gone,
yes.
And that we had a duty to the Iraqi people in any case to help them reconstitute their society. So.
Looking at what has happened, do you now hope that, do you have hopes for Iraq now? I mean, there was a time when it seemed ridiculous to have hopes for it, but I suppose...
Well, look, Iraq can either be a country run by force by a minority of its minority, in other words, a gangster tribe of the Sunni minority, the Tikriti group around Saddam Hussein, repressing everyone else because the oil is where they don't live. Or you can have federalism, or you can have civil war and partition. Now, our policy, when I say ours, I mean that of the US, Britain, Australia, has been to offer them federalism, say, and where disputes that arise naturally from the society must be solved by elections. With a parliament and a free press. We got really amazingly close to that. I mean, my friends in Kurdistan, Iraqi Kurdistan, just had a really bitter election, very hard fought. Existing Kurdish ruling parties, described as openly by Kurdish people, many of them as corrupt, brutal, too accustomed to power, nearly voted out. It's unbelievable. This was when I first saw these territories of Iraq after the first Gulf War. They were impoverished. Their cities were in ruins. You couldn't print a newspaper. You could still see people who couldn't breathe or were already dead because of chemical gas. It was a poisoned wasteland. And now it's the most intensely democratic And I might add secular. This is not.
Well, you're talking about Kurdistan,
Al
not.
Qaeda doesn't even try it.
But Kurdistan has always been a case apart. The rest of Iraq is still in a very difficult
situation. But there are still, for example, I mean, people say the Iranians have too much influence on the Iraqi Shia. It's true, in my opinion, that the Revolutionary Guards have been allowed to get away with a lot in Iraq. But it's also true in the recent democratic events in Iran that these things cut both ways. There's a dialectic to it. The left used to be interested in dialectics. They're not anymore. But Mr. Rafsanjani and other Iranian opposition people have been going to Qum to meet with Ayatollah Sistani, who is against the concept of a supreme leader, against the idea of a theocratic dictatorship. There's a cross-fertilization going on in that way too, and Iraqi Shia parties have to compete now for votes. They can't just bully them out of people. Same with Iraqi Sunni ones, and secular parties too. So, look, people think federally, and to an extent they think federally, and democratically to an extent, and the country is no longer the private property of a heavily armed criminal family that had aggressive intentions on its neighbours. I can't see why people are so upset that this has happened. I think we should be proud of having played our little part in it.
Christopher Hitchens is with us. We're talking partly about his new book, God Is Not Great. He's appearing at the Opera House's Festival of Dangerous Ideas this weekend. 1300 222 702 is the number. 1300 222 702. Can we move on to Afghanistan? Because, of course, that is where Australia...
Well, we're clearing these things up.
Yes, well, Australia in particular has got a big commitment there and has had some deaths there as well. A lot of people still form the view that this is a totally unwinnable war and there's no point at all in being there. What's your view?
Well, I think that there is a difference between governing Afghanistan, or trying to govern it, and intervening in it to make sure that the Afghans who want self-government and don't want their country turned into a Stone Age theocracy and don't want it to be a harbour for vicious criminals are the ones who win. And I'm pretty certain we're not getting that balance right. I don't think, you see, that the Taliban on their own could take Afghanistan back. They were only able to do it last time because of a complete power vacuum, and because a lot of other people didn't know what it would be like, including, for example, the Tajik minority or the Hazara, largely
of whom many have come to this country.
Cousinhood have a cousinhood to Persia and to the Persian language and to the Shia. These whose power in the state and in the society is, they're not going to lie down under Taliban rule again. Nor I think would many city dwellers allow it. So there's a huge Afghan willingness to fight. If we appear to be on the side, however, of a lazy, second-rate, corrupt government that's involved in all the rackets and so forth, then we have a chance of spoiling that for everybody. So I think the question really is not, do we have an interest in the outcome in Afghanistan? Of course we do. Are we willing to show that we'd fight for that? Absolutely we ought to. Absolutely ought to.
But this is always the problem.
Is the, so to say, footprint right? But sir, I don't think any of your listeners have turned in to hear me as if I was a military expert.
But on the wider sort of...
I have been there. I can give you the benefit of a few thoughts, but... I can tell you why, just for one thing. What's the definition of a warlord? Very commonly, a warlord is someone who can interrupt a piece of road. So you can't pass on this bit of road without paying me or doing something for me. That's what a warlord is. So that the road building program in Afghanistan is something we should have a lot to do with, because if you can have long, wide, straight, good roads, warlordism does to that extent go away. Do I think we should buy the drug crop and make painkillers out of it rather than try and burn it? Yes, I do. I don't think you can liberate people and then come and say, by the way, we've come to burn your only cash crop. I think that's unbelievably stupid, as the whole war on drugs is stupid.
The trouble about intervention, though, always is, and we began this discussion when you said you weren't a pacifist, it's always a matter of politicians or armchair generals or columnists or whatever sending other people's young men into battle. That's always the problem, though, isn't it?
No one, I don't know anyone who's been sent against their will. I mean, as far as I know, the Australian Army is a volunteer one. The British one certainly is. I'm not going to say who, but a young relative of mine is one of those in Afghanistan, in Helmand province now. I didn't send this young lady. I can't send anyone from America either. No,